Women definitely uphold the patriarchy.
No. What I'm saying is that I'm not sure that what you're talking about really as a patriarchy is some kind of fundamental system or a bunch of people trying to stay in power as much as it is the way that humans actually interact with each other, because we're distinct, ontologically different creatures.
Would you say that it's maybe like a better description? Because there were matriarchies. It was just like patriarchies consistently outcompeted.
There really weren't ever matriarchies. There were matriarchs, but they really, all of their force conditions for the monopoly on force were still upheld by men.
So this isn't totally true. What we actually see when you go back to like Paleolithic eras of like Homo sapiens is that patriarchy was just more effective at like coordinating war efforts. Like they just killed everyone else.
In Paleolithic societies especially, what you mostly see are chiefs, and you see men who are high-level men. You don't see matriarchs.
So you did. The problem is that you didn't. You did. Where? Okay.
Name a culture.
I actually don't know the names of any Paleolithic culture specifically.
But you do know that there was matriarchs in them.
Absolutely. So like if you go, so there's a really good book I'd recommend. It's called Sapiens. It's by Yuval Harari, and it tracks basically the evolution of like Homo sapiens psychology specifically. Because we need to understand that, like, for example, a secular argument for Abrahamic religions is that it's been, bar none, the most evolutionarily successful at setting up the best societies ever, which is why it's the most dominant thing. It's not this like crazy evil thing. The same thing with patriarchies. It's reasonable to presume, especially when you get into like these lost tribes and we do see matriarchies, not as often, but often enough, that there were lots of matriarchies, but the reality is that the patriarchy was fundamentally a more competitive organizational system.
Let's grant for a second that even that's true. That there was matriarchies within Paleolithic societies. Okay, I'll grant you for the sake of argument. In recorded history, of which there's about 6,000-7,000 years, there could be some things pre that, but we had like the Library of Alexandria burned down, so we don't know. We lost a lot. Okay, so we don't really know how far back it goes. Since this is true, and we only can go back about 7,000 years, if you look at that record, there's not really any matriarchies anywhere.
I agree. I would say like it seems to be the case that like when tribes were just forming to a space where they were like family competitors against one another, that seems to be where matriarchy dominantly lost.
Yeah, so then
I just want to be clear that like
matriarchies
aren't inherently biological. Like patriarchy isn't inherently biological. It's just more competitive.
Since the conditions have existed for societies, actual societies, the way that we understand them, which is not tribal throw spirit things anymore. It hasn't been for thousands of years. We've had the coalition of societies. We have not seen that formula. What we've seen instead is a strong patriarchate everywhere in the world, basically at all times.
Sure, but
basically
the
always.
Is a lot less masculine than we like to act like it is in many ways. Like this is actually one of my biggest frustrations with feminists when they talk about patriarchy, is that the most successful patriarchies were patriarchies that could socially organize large groups of people, and they did so through the inventions of state and the inventions of things like religion. These are fundamental to coordinating people beyond 250 bodies.
I don't understand how that's not masculine.
Because social coordination and social cohesion and like making social groups work is almost always attributed to being a feminine trait.
No, it's not. Of course it isn't.
In literature, it always
No, it's not. Listen,
who's organizing the home?
Who's organizing corporations? Who's in charge?
It is men.
Who's in government?
Yeah.
All of these are all orders for social organization.
Exactly, because men are allowed to be feminine, and feminine and masculine traits are both necessary for flourishing societies.
You're saying that you're only assigning it as being feminine, even though when we're looking at the historic record, it doesn't seem like it's feminine at all. It seems like it's a very much a masculine trait to be able to do mass organization, especially of other men. A thing of which you almost never see women do.
Do you think organizing is feminine or masculine?
Organization?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It could be a neutral.
Who thinks
but
like
I think
keeping
that
people together.
I think the way it's done is masculine or feminine. I think that the way women could do it through forms of manipulation, backstabbery, secret telling.
There's no way that women
could
do it in like a neutral to positive way.
They can, but it's not often done that way.
I mean, that's not true. If we look at family lines,
it is true.
Who's that one that like everyone goes to? When grandma dies, the family's fucked because she was like the main person coordinating these things.
Unless
they come from a long line of strong women, right?
But sometimes
women are
ahead.
often social
No.
coordinators. Who's
We're
most
talking,
HR?
but we're
Who's
talking
most
about in
mid-management?
society. You're
I
giving
am
these
talking
little
about society.
tiny outliers for individual family units. We're talking about the majority of society, the majority of human history that's
Men
recorded.
rose to the top in all
majority,
things,
the majority
yes.
of societies were completely and totally organized by men.
That
And
doesn't
not
make
only
it
were
not a
they
feminine
organized
trait.
by men, but the way in which they were organized, which was with kind of the cracking of the whip, right? Here's what the Spartan warriors are going to do. Here's what our
If
army's
you
going
think
to do.
that it was
Here's
just the cracking of the whip, then you have a really bad understanding of how
I'm not
the
saying it
Spartan
was
army
just
went.
anything.
Well,
I'm giving you an example
I
of
know.
how this is
Is it
definitely
possible?
not a feminine trait.
Because I feel like we're disagreeing on something that we don't need to. Is it not possible that most of the patriarchies, which were dominantly run by men, because men tend to be more extreme at most things, incorporated both feminine and masculine traits, even though it was still a patriarchy?
No, I wouldn't. No,
there
I don't
any
think
way-
so. I think that even here, kind of the semantic distinction needs to be made. No, I don't think that organization in massive society is a feminine trait, and I don't know how you could convince me that it is.
Okay, because we would talk about like the fundamental traits. If organization and social cohesion and empathy are dominantly, well, like you can apply it to masculinities if you want. I don't give a fuck. All this stuff is like socially made and socially organized.
Yeah.
But when we look back at history, when like literature talks about like the social cohesion agent or the organizing agent, it's oftentimes the women. They're given like nurturance role. They're given
It's
in like collection and like organization roles. That's why
mean,
even in our society we see
hang
women.
on.
Hold on, you gotta let me
Okay,
finish.
go ahead.
This is why even in our society, what do you see like dominating HR? One of the most important human organization groups.
I gotta
Dominantly
push
women.
back again. I think that what you're talking about here is support roles. So yes, women are great in support organizational roles, but here's what they're not great at. They're not great quartermasters. They're not great equipment masters. They're not great at organizing armies. They're not great at any of that. What they are great is at smaller tasks like paymasters, organizing for food, organizing for cookware, things like this. Though before we, could organize women to do cooking, basically the Roman legions would go around and actually collect food themselves. But what I'm saying to you is that no, I think that for smaller tasks, for support tasks, yes, nursing, things like this. But I think that when it comes to the overarching society and how it's organized, yeah, I would say that it's definitely masculine. Same thing, churches, organized societies in a big way. You cited that yourself.
Sure.
Those
What
were
do you think
basically
my
always
position
run
is?
by men everywhere.
Sure. What do you think my position is?
Well, I think that you're trying to say that organization is a feminine trait.
Okay. Do you know the rest of my take with that, or is that the main part?
Well, I mean, this is what we're arguing over.
Sort of. We're arguing about masculinities and femininities. That's what we're talking about.
But you're saying that mass organization is more of a female or a
I said,
feminine
no,
trait.
I didn't say mass organization. I said organizing people based on social structures is dominantly more feminine. It seems to be a more feminine trait not because women do it more often. It's exclusively, do you know what the word arate means? I'm sorry if I'm being super nerdy. And it's okay if you don't. It's like a really obscure word. Okay, arate was this concept in the Greek that was like, it's this idea of like the most important cultural value. And the way that we tend to like look at cultures is by what their literature writes about. When you look at the literature when it comes to like social connection, social organization, and social glue factors, typically that the literature that our society is based on puts women in that role dominantly. Whereas things
put
like
them in-
protectiveness, leadership is often where men, that would be something that we would call a masculinity.
Yeah, but the leadership and mass organization, this is exactly what I'm saying, in fact. So you're talking about minor support rules for organization. You're talking about things like nursing and
talking
childcare,
about-
things like this.
No.
But when you're doing actual organization of men,
I'm talking about forms.
which forms?
I'm talking about like platonic forms.
Yeah, but
essentially.
why would you say platonic forms and then look at modern civilization? That's what you just
Okay,
cited.
Sorry, I think I lost you there. When I'm saying I'm looking at platonic forms, you're saying like, yeah, but women do this role. And I'm saying that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the emergent themes that societies ascribe to masculinity versus femininity.
And I'm telling you that those themes in line with masculinity definitely have to do with the roles of
Leadership.
massive armies and the organization of those massive of armies, the organizations of churches, the organizations of building of infrastructure, the organizations of all
This
of
is
these
not
things.
masculinities. These are not forms. These are things that men are doing in the patriarchy. When we're talking
Oh, you
about
mean-
masculinity, we're talking about character traits typically. We're talking about things like protectiveness, leadership, aggression. Assertiveness is typically associated with masculinity, whereas with femininity, it's typically empathy, right? Nurturance. These are things that are
Yeah,
attached
okay,
to
so
each of these
you
concepts.
you can pop these with like, this is how I attribute these things. Fine. But what I'm saying is that as a matter of record, it is not the case that women really are the ones
never
organizing
said that.
anything in
I've never
society.
said
So
that.
if that's just the point that you want to add that as a feminine trait, fine. I'll concede it just to move the conversation on.
literally my only point.
But when it's mapped onto reality, that
Men
is
are
not what we
always
see.
in the leadership, and they always
Yeah,
tend to be more
so when
extreme.
we
Of
go back
course.
to the point then, and we're talking about when the men feels bad and the woman feels bad, and how women and men both, interact with how men and women feel bad, you can see why there'd be a distinction for how women judge men and how men judge men.
Oh, for sure.
And why
Totally.
that would be necessary, that men do show a bit less emotion, probably a lot less emotion. That also, one thing I found here in this podcast, every single episode I've watched, this question usually gets asked: do you want a more dominant man or a less dominant man? And you know what they all say? I want a more dominant man. And I want him to show less emotion. And I want him to show more leadership, which is what you were saying. Yeah. And more virtues, which is what you were saying. That's what they all say.
Sure, and I would agree with basically all of that. The point that I was trying to make is what tends to make people, like when we look at the most respect-worthy people, I'm not sure if there's any like